Good evening. Thank you. We'll start. I'm Joan Busquets, Martin Buxman, Professor of Practice in Urban Planning and Design, and I'm extremely pleased to introduce the Druker Fellowship tonight. It was established in 1986 by Ronald Druker, Love Fellow 76. The Druker Traveling Fellowship is the GSD first international focus travel fellowship dedicated to urban planning. It was created 38 years ago. It seems a long time. The fellowship offers students the opportunity to travel domestically or abroad to continue a study that advances their understanding on urban design. The fellowship is open to all GSD master degree candidates who propose innovative projects that demonstrate excellence in the design of urban environments. The fellowship must be used within 2 years of received graduation, and the recipient is expected to deliver a lecture at the GSD, like is going to happen tonight. In this period, 35 GSD students has been awarded the Druker Fellowship. Well, today we are very fortunate because among us we have the person that created the fellowship and has been following the GSD trajectory in the last 5 decades. Allow me to invite Ron Druker to come to the podium to address a few words to the audience. Please join me in welcoming Ron.
It's always a treat for me, and because I'm able to say I'm actually here. I'm fortunate to be in a position to endow a fellowship like this fellowship, but even more fortunate to know all the recipients. William, fellowship number 1, is sitting in the front seat, and all the remaining 34 afterwards. And there's one fellow, I guess he's a fellow, who was from Madrid, who was fellow number 3, who took the money and ran. We've been unable to find this guy. I called Rafa Nadal to see what he could do, but no, the guy took the money and ran. And the only good news is that it was less money than the money is today, just because Harvard management hadn't done its job and it's not 8 years later. But look, I'm lucky enough to travel a lot. And I thought that one of the things that would be great would be to let students have the benefit of travel. And today, it's a lot of money. And people are able to travel pretty well. It's not so easy to travel, but people travel everywhere. And it just makes me feel good to be part of tonight and to be here. This school played a major role in my life and has over the last 45 years. I look forward to, we've got to celebrate, I think we might celebrate our 40th, not to be too aggressive in looking to celebrate the 50th, but if we celebrate the 40th and there's a 50th, I'll be there. So in any event, thank you all for being here. Is there anyone from UTIL here tonight? I know that. So, and by the way, I'm their landlord. So.
Thank you very much, Ron. Yeah. Let me introduce the speaker tonight. Sam Naylor is a MAUD 21. He's an architect, educator, and researcher of multifamily housing in the US. Currently, he is an associate at UTL in Boston. He's the lead designer for Equitable by Design, a zoning research project at the Northeastern University. Sam is the co-editor of the State of Housing Design 2023. That is a very nice and very effective compendium of the national housing architecture published by the Joint Center for Housing Studies of the Harvard University. I think it's a fantastic contribution, and thank you, Sam, for your work on that. But today, Sam is here among us as the Harvard Druker Fellow, investigating cooperative housing around the world. He believes everyone has a right to a dignified, affordable, and delightful dwelling by imaginative design for housing, from the block to the bedroom. And he is putting theory into practice by renovating a cooperatively owned triple-deck building with friends in Jamaica Plain. Perhaps he will share his experience with us, I don't know. Today, he will discuss the impact for housing design based on the analysis of the over 100 cooperative projects across the globe, with an extremely provocative title, Living Without Land. I'm wondering how it's going to be. With this lecture today, we are going to see how important the Druker Fellowship is, because allow all us to receive this fresh input from Sam Naylor. I think that is very important, something fresh coming from outside, from this review of across the globe is going to be presented tonight. Please welcome back Sam to the GSD.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Joan. Thank you, Ron. And it's great to be here tonight. It's great to see a lot of friends and colleagues. I do want to follow the lead to just say, to remark upon the fact that most of the projects you will see tonight and which I visited are on unceded land that has and continues to be taken, occupied, and colonized, including places now known as Argentina, Australia, Uruguay, and the United States, and whose original inhabitants are listed here. While I focus this talk on cooperative communities formed in the 20th and 21st centuries, it's important to acknowledge that there is a much longer and wider legacy of cooperative living examples outside of modernity and outside of the settler narrative. The lecture is structured in 5 parts. But we'll start with kind of an overview and then end with some lessons learned. So in 1975, under austerity and a depression, a group of squatters took over a series of row houses along Fleet Road in London. Eventually, they gained funding from the Camden Housing Council to form a social cooperative and partnered with an architect to renovate the block into a community that had notably heat and running water, but also a shared backyard, guest suites, common areas, collective balconies, and over 25 homes which would be rented out at below market rate rent permanently. The community became a haven, particularly for single gay men who have been left aside by society at the time. It provided a home for non-hierarchical living, sexual discovery, and new ways of living and working. On a tour, one resident told me that if it weren't for a neighbor checking in on him during Christmas, he wouldn't be here today, and that the co-op saved his life. This is the potential for cooperative housing at its best, and the kind of story I heard many times. That's inspiring in its own right and instructional for people looking at housing as more than a product. So most of the field research has taken place over the last 3 years. I know they said 2 years, but I took 1 extra. And in that time, I have moved twice, held over a dozen jobs, got married, published a book, bought a home, and adopted a dog. All to say, for the next recipient, I have some advice about consolidating your travels, but that the struggle of working around an American holiday schedule is real. The trips were also an amazing companion to be able to see best practices abroad and then incorporate them into lessons learned for books and reports back home. In all, I visited well over 150 housing projects, but for the focus of this lecture and report, we'll focus on just 73 of them, which were all cooperative in some way. There was an effort to include a wide range of projects, both rural and urban, scattered and condensed, old and new, all with a filter of cooperation, and all which had novel designs. Part of the genesis of this work was an interest in cooperative housing, but a frustration with the lack of literature on design as an aspect of the projects. So a lot had been written about in terms of their liberating labor and financial aspects, but few articles or volumes were talking about the spatial possibilities they unlocked. So I've tried to assemble a lot of the literature I have found on the subject of design here today, and it's been really instructive for my own research and work. Only a couple of the books are not in English. Over the years, I've also made an effort for myself, mostly to put my resources and incomplete research online on a publicly available website, and it's really been a helpful way to communicate with others and have a repository of the resources. This, along with a sketchbook and giving already a couple lectures on the work, were really helpful avenues to continue to ponder the problems and opportunities of cooperative housing. Much of the travel was condensed into 5 primary trips, of which were preceded by months and months of emailing and messaging everyone and anyone who would respond. Often with really poorly translated messages, I would hope to break through the silence. Residents were often the primary point of contact, but so were architects, builders, developers, and landscape architects, who sometimes lived in the community or remained involved long after inception. Much of my thanks goes to my wife, Elaine, who was able to accompany me on most of the trips and was instrumental for translation, note-taking, and being an excellent scale figure. Ultimately, my biggest thanks are to the people who invited me into their communities and were incredibly generous with their time. And not only time, but their space and stories. It's not every day you invite a stranger on your couch, show them your literal dirty laundry, and let them take photos of it. Much can be said for the digital camera, but I'm also grateful the art of scrapbooking is alive and well, and often was the most fruitful way for others to share their histories behind their communities. That and the occasional climb up a rooftop filled with water or into a basement of archives. Finally, to say that the nature of housing is that it's people's homes, and the ability to capture design in photography was crucial for my work, but almost always excluded people in the images that you'll see tonight for the sake of privacy. So even though you'll see a lot of photos of bare rooms, I can assure you that more life was happening beyond the frame in every single project. So first, cooperative housing, writ large, presents, as I see it, a third path forward for housing affordability and tenure. Whereas in the private rental market, you have options of where to live and how to live, but only if you have the capital. And then in the subsidized rental market, which is accessible only by lottery, offers less options for where and how to live. In both ownership markets, you either build wealth at the expense of others next in line, or you're stuck with the burden of maintaining a home without the increase of wealth that will allow you to stay in your neighborhood for the long term. Cooperatives offer a third option outside of speculation and outside of simple ownership. The second thing that gets me really excited about cooperative living is the spatial possibilities. So whereas in a typical market rate housing project, communal space would be limited to 5 or 10% of the overall project, in cooperative housing that can be as high as 30%. And the shrinking of the private sphere, as exhibited by the chair in this photo, does not necessarily mean less space, but just a different kind of space, and often actually a more liberating use of space. Programmatically, these uses are often much broader than the entertainment-focused amenities in your typical development. They are geared towards a wider age range, a wider sound range, a wider messiness range, offering amenities that would otherwise be deemed cluttered, a nuisance, or unnecessary, but in fact often come after the project is complete and as a direct result of resident management. The age range of cooperative housing is broader than any one market rate housing project I can think of. Denmark's co-housing origins, importantly, follow the idea that children should have 100 parents. And it's this embedded ideal of forever homes that make the most sense for creating a city or environment where you don't have to move away from your support network to be financially stable. And of those, co-housing and, just to say, I'm very interested in this, but US cooperative housing only makes up 3% of homes. And of those, co-housing and community land trusts are an even smaller percentage. Combined, they equal just over 38,000 units, or a bit over half the homes in Cambridge. Worldwide, the countries which I visited, cooperatives do a bit better, but are still the vast minority of share of homes. When it does get interesting is when cities themselves have an outsized share of cooperatives, which is the case in Zurich and Copenhagen. In these highly speculative urban centers, a large share of cooperative housing can greatly ease affordability and increase length of tenure. But to first set up what we're talking about and lay out the terms that I'll be using, I'd probably say cooperative generally, but almost all the projects fit within these 4 buckets: cooperative, co-housing, co-living, and community land trusts. There's also many other names these go by in other cultures and contexts, and also a lot of interesting hybrids that are created within. Probably the majority of projects are either cooperative or co-housing. So to say a little bit more about the way in which these terms get complicated, it's good to look at the relationship between land and labor. So how much a project shares responsibilities or delegates them is on the y-axis, and how much the common ground is communal or private on the x-axis. Because co-housing can have cooperative ownership or be fee simple, and individual ownership projects can also have a high degree of cooperative management. Generally, I looked at the projects at the lower end of the spectrum, which have a high degree of social cooperation but range from speculatively expensive to socially cheap. To speak a bit about the different types more in depth, co-living, for example, is a newer term and encompasses more high-end rental and furnished apartments geared towards younger professionals, students, and mobile white-collar workers. On the East Coast, they are clustered more in urban centers and are branded product-type communities with names like Folk, Firm, Vibe, or Gravity. In contrast, co-housing is often in more suburban or rural areas which offer cheaper land and a more traditional idea, at least in the US, of family-centered community. Cooperatives and community land trusts, on the other hand, are more defined by their financial and organizational structure, which favors collective consensus and shared ownership. In Australia, CHL, the country's largest cooperative housing provider, operating in Victoria, for example, has a network of hundreds of cooperatives, each one from 1 to multiple dozen units, operates organizationally on its own with the help of financial stewardship. In comparison, community land trusts, such as the Champlain Valley CLT, the largest in the world, also operate as a network, but often by subsuming existing buildings and thus are often invisible, in that you would not know which house or unit is part of the collective, but by working together, they can provide an outlet from speculation. Co-housing, lastly, is perhaps the most cooperative in organization and daily labor in comparison to financial. Often size from 10 to 50 families, they have weekly meals, small working groups around shared maintenance and activities, and mostly operate on a consensus basis. What you're seeing here is a snapshot of the organizational structure of Marmalade Lane co-housing in England, and the kind of weekly meal where everyone comes together, and then the smaller working groups or households and the different clusters and cadence of when they meet. It was really exciting for me to see how different communities under the same organizational structure operated or were designed, such as these 5 co-housing communities in different regions, which had a different cadence of shared meals. You can see 3 times a week, 5 times a week, but that didn't correlate at all to their group size. So, to talk about the spaces in 3 acts. starting with overlapping spaces. As is the case with most new housing, all the good sites are gone. And what's left is often more difficult parcels of land. Both of these projects were built over top of and adjacent to existing light and heavy rail service. In Calbright on the right, that's the name, the proximity to the rail and resultant noise levels drove the entire design of the project. Its courtyard massing, windows, and circulation, which in fact were mandated by local regulations that monitor intense noise reduction standards, and a culture of true design competitions for cooperative housing schemes. And also is the case here in London, at the Copper Lane co-housing, where a group of residents worked with what was fallow and forgotten land inside a dense block of row homes, creating a community with narrow conditions through which to have a garden, street, or yard. In other places, cooperatives were instrumental in the long work of revitalizing abandoned factories and hospitals from a previous century, both a result of the lack of funds and a willingness to self-labor, sometimes over decades, by the very people living next door. In Granby 4th Street CLT, row house by row house are being renovated and occupied. The fabric today, although complete in the urban sense, is in a constant state of renovation. Other projects are built entirely on new land, such as these in Denmark and the Netherlands, where reclaimed oceanfront is increasingly the only option, or seen as the only option, for further urbanization in countries fully built out at the mid-rise or low-rise high-density scale. Or actually floating on the water, such as the Schoonship co-housing community in Amsterdam, where cooperative development and design created a community rich in diverse expression, but connected by a common ground that was not ground at all. It's also amazing to see what collective conservation of land can do to site planning, where here in a project near Minneapolis, 250 acres of forest, meadow, and wetland are preserved, and single-family homes are packed around a circular loop with intermediate paths for pedestrians cutting across the blocks. Often it's the case that access and presence of cars are reduced, even in suburban and rural projects. Preference is for shared parking areas and even shared cars themselves. This opens up the rest of the site not only to more productive uses, but also to a safer area for kids to pass through, a feature that was uncommon in neighboring market rate developments, but a crucial component of cooperative living. The ability to walk easily between homes and common spaces, run into each other, and steward shared spaces. Aspects of the site and landscape design further emphasize the cooperative control or lack of control that is at the edges of circulation. Corner fences, mobile planters, and broken walls emphasize a partial ownership and porosity, where privacy is delineated but not defined. This is especially seen in the Wandelment project near Amsterdam, where homes are arranged along a winding pedestrian path with consolidated parking on the outskirts. And the path is purposely intersected by these cluster kitchens which serve 5 homes. Boundaries between the path or the public and each other's clusters, common space, and even private entries are arranged on an ad hoc and provisional basis, leaving flexibility over time by residents in a way that favors the collective over the individual. In many projects, there was also an intent to purposely make the street or center open to the public, and yet still use tactical tools of delineation to make visitors aware of the semi-private nature of the space. Some of this is done at the entry, where transition from public to communal is celebrated, but pinched, allowing you in but marking the transition. There are also similar kinds of thresholds inside projects between neighbors, when the desire to collapse creates a shared backyard, porch, stoop, patio, or laundromat. In the building group project in Berlin, multi-story dwelling units are stacked side by side and on top of each other on alternating floors. Intersecting geometries and plan create moments when, as an inhabitant told me, you can see each other getting dressed. The only privacy offered is through full-height curtains and tilted volumes. In the urban Coop project in Melbourne, Australia, the co-housing group decided not to subdivide their balconies, creating a series of shared terraces that on some levels are connected by shared amenities, bringing the common all the way through the plan. These kinds of shared terraces were common, but had different expressions in terms of proximity to one's neighbor, above, below, beside, or from afar. The overlapping use of space is key, but the other element these kinds of walkways and terraces provide are sightlines to shared community spaces. It's important to be able to see what's going on before you decide to join, and it's equally important to capture folks in informal conversations. Instance is only possible when the transparency and circulation around the common room is carefully choreographed. In both of these projects in the Netherlands and Denmark, alternating panes of fire-protected glass offered views at and through common rooms and kitchens. It's about transparency, but it's also layered with buffer uses so that direct social engagement isn't required, but is always possible. I found it really fascinating how these hallways were often wider than what's needed for circulation. Rather than conduits of efficiency, their scale prompts appropriation. Libraries, offices, lounges, kitchens, gardens, and more pop up alongside purposely broad halls. And not only broad, but also in comparison to other housing in the same context, usually more exterior. A condition perhaps brought about by financial necessity, but one uniquely identifiable to cooperatives and with which your front door feels like a street in the neighborhood rather than on a hall in a building. Assembly. If overlapping spaces are the underlying conditions of cooperation, spaces of assembly are where collective action takes place most intensely, with courtyards as the typology being foremost among them. Often littered with children's toys, these heavily planted voids were often the genesis of projects, forming well before the spaces for dwelling and surviving as clearly to the public as to the residents what values the community has. However, it really became clear how smaller spaces of vertical assembly, or stairs, were the real key to congestion, as seen here in the Abiona Cooperative, where each stair becomes a celebrated moment geometrically and programmatically linking shared guest suites, kitchens, and common rooms with a collective rear yard. Heavy investment was made into the railings, doors, skylights, and ornamentation to make sure they're used and loved. Most projects seen overseas were point-loaded housing types, or to put it another way, almost every project I saw outside of our country would be illegal to build today in Boston or much of North America. If you'll allow me a little soapbox, this is a travesty for density, but more so for livability. These spaces, often exterior, were the main intersections of communities, rife with signage, postings, strollers, planters, junk, and movement. The lifeblood of social vibrancy and the bringer of natural light and air. Okay, I'm done with single stair. The common room, or the common house, is often the significant element in co-housing and some cooperative communities. It's the dedicated spaces for communal activities, meetings, and materials, usually centered around a central eating and meeting hall. But many projects expand upon the common house, adding a common theater or gymnasium. And like many elements, they were often only built because a resident involved in the formation and the development had the skills in the arts or sports and could translate into stewarding the space and performances, renting it out, programming it. And then also the size of these spaces, the scale and density really required an engagement with the surrounding neighborhood and community, which was exciting as a genesis to bring these projects in concert with their context. On weekly gatherings, though, it's mealtime that brings everyone together. The community kitchen or kitchens were vital spaces of expression and labor. Often meals cost a few dollars or are bundled into housing fees, and labor is distributed on a rotating basis. What this means for design is that the open shelving and labeling are your friends. Larger communities have upgraded to industrial kitchens, while some cluster-based communities have a series of smaller kitchens shared by 6 or 10 families. More people also means more involvement in the kinds of cooking that would be unreasonable for a single small family. Fire pits and pizza ovens were particularly common and often part of the weekly meal rotation in warmer weather. Built by residents, these artifacts are some of the best interpretations of a commonality and as a visual reminder of cultural difference or similarity. While some of these meals take place in the common room, there's also a trend of scattering seating adjacent to and on the way from the common house. And in comparison to market rate housing, the scattering of chairs and tables represents a freedom from top-down tidiness and a comfort of the individual appropriation. What's also clear is that movability in furnishings extends to flexibility in programming, and where in some communities they invite over 1,000 people in the summertime for an all-day gathering, the stacking of chairs indicates the presence of crowds without the pretense of prescription. And just like the Shakers' custom collective benches, the social life of cooperatives sometimes manifests in self-built, custom fabricated elements, like these tables, that reflect the scale and proportion of gathering together. While constant communication is vital to the early genesis of projects, it's clear that public and internal communication also serves to strengthen internal ideals and relationships. Sometimes this is a generous section on resources in a project's website, a story about their founding on a roadside placard, or a 60-year-old weekly newsletter about anything and everything that's happening outside of your front door. The labor involved in making these places work also necessitates manual communication over the virtual. And while many communities had extensive apps and internal digital networks, ever present was the collective calendar board and matrix of chores. Records of those tasks, finances, and events also have to be kept somewhere and result in true community libraries and archives, or administration offices. These libraries also extend to the street, exhibiting the values of the community to the neighborhood and inviting others to be part of the sharing culture. Maybe the most notable part of the communication with neighbors is through murals, which often communicate the values of a community. Values of democracy, optimism, diversity, women's rights, peace, and redemption. These are the same ideals that form a project's genesis, one in which many disparate people get together to design a community from whole cloth. Sometimes a key member or protagonist of a group is versed in professional design or development, and they serve to guide others in a collective design process. What was great to see in this instance were the lack of assumptions about what should be designed and how it should be designed. On the left, you can see a Sharpied cardboard cutout representing future fans and speakers in a shared room. Elements left on the wall for weeks to get community buy-in before finalizing placement and construction. And on the right, paper cutout houses individually colored by community members on a hillside contour model to explain the design and construction process. In another project, in Delft, in Netherlands, Central Wonen, a robust community design process was undertaken to envision a truly flexible series of buildings where you do not rent a unit, but you rent a room or several rooms, and thus your unit size can change by the month and morph and flex as your needs for space or amenities change over time. Full one-to-one mock-ups of rooms were cooperatively created in a university gymnasium to communicate the scale and flexibility of those spaces. And imbued in the facade was a translation of that spatial flexibility, that residents could change out panels over time to suit their needs, installing windows, changing the colors, or adding insulation. Modifications that manifest internal mutations as architectural expressions. Finally, the spaces that most notably make these projects different from the typical approach is how they view time and tenure, in that they anticipate and desire for people to live in a community possibly for their entire lives. This translates down to spaces, elements, and articulation that are multi-generational and multi-purpose, including loud spaces, as one resident told me about, specifically not a music room, but for anything loud, for teenagers to party, for therapeutic screaming, for action movies at full volume, or anything you want. If the garage is the one space most missing from multifamily housing, it's ever present in surveyed projects and highly utilized. Often as a hybrid workshop, auto body shop, ceramic space, and art studio, it pays dividends to consolidate money for tools and spaces of repair in a shared room rather than individually. And the constant repair and maintenance of the projects, often done by the residents themselves, necessitates these spaces and makes people care for and feel ownership of the project as well over time. It's also what allows spaces to be left unfinished at the end of initial construction. For shared rooms, alleys, and alcoves to be finished later, when funding or collective designs are more available and agreed upon. The most often shared maintenance is, of course, clothes washing and drying. In a couple communities, the collective washroom had tags and bins that you would label with your name and desired wash settings. And then as someone took their stuff out, they would make sure whoever's next got put in, and so on. So similar to shared car use, the efficiency of washers per person goes up, wasted space goes down, and cooperation is the key. Maintenance of the grounds, streets, and gardens also revealed a propensity for productive plantings, for appropriation of public space for private plantings, for rooftop greenhouses, and for food production in scales and forms that would only be possible through collective action, such as mushroom harvesting, which takes over a year, composting, and seasonally cycled crops. The relationship to food then, from the ground to the table, is shrunk, and similar to the free libraries, public pantries exhibit the values of the community to themselves and others. As I mentioned at the beginning, designs for collective childcare or a community with 100 parents is foremost among the principles in all projects, and can be seen in the scales of spaces and looseness through which surfaces get appropriated and toys left abound. Common houses always had a kids' room with soft furnishings, a place for them to keep each other busy while the dinner was being prepared. And outdoor spaces, similarly, were often centered around an in-project daycare or playground. Beyond the people that lived in a project, guest rooms, suites, and houses also provided flexibility for others to stay over for a night or a month at a low cost, really expanding unit types by including length of stay as a parameter. The range of unit types was also really dramatic in some projects that allowed a lot of flexibility. For example, the Zwickau project in Switzerland, units range from a 20-bedroom cluster suite to studios, 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4-bedroom types. A range made so that when your family grew or shrunk, you would be gently coerced to move down or up a unit. Some of the cluster suites here, which in reality are really small co-housing communities of themselves with their own collective meal schedule, chores, and maintenance regimes. What's also really amazing about some projects is how the collective development and design process is exhibited through the architectural design. Whether it's multifamily on the left or more single family on the right, everyone gets to design their own space, choose the size, orientation, or balcony, of course with a lot of difficulty. And then even in expression of buildings and communities where the framework is more fixed, there's a lot of opportunities for expression, mutation, or change over time in how you get to work within the same system, either through the design process or after the fact, to be able to express your home and your unit and yourself so that the community feels together and diverse at the same time. I think what was really exciting, lastly, about the kind of flexibility achieved through cooperation was to look at one community. So this is co-housing in Denmark, one of, if not the oldest in the world. And when I asked someone about the most annoying thing or the worst thing, he said that damn trampoline. Now it's just a trampoline, but you know, he would say how the kids would be on it day and night, screaming and yelling and playing. So in a typical development project where you're really working towards the least defensible product, you would just eliminate that program. But here, to balance the needs of the individuality and the collective, the decision was to move it every so often to the next part of the common space. So you really liberate the space and program utilizing time and cooperation as the key. And I know it's just a trampoline or several trampolines. Tasmania really likes trampolines. But I think it shows a really novel way of dealing with space and program and conflicting uses by thinking across time. Lastly, just some end notes. So while there's a great variety in the approaches to design, projects in most respects follow the standard practices of their context. This goes down to structural materials, car, pedestrian-centric layouts, building ventilation, staircases, and more. What this illuminates for me as a practitioner in the US is that despite being the richest country in the history of the world, we have a huge poverty in our housing design. A poverty that, as I see it, is not deliberate, but is a result of a contraction in the scope through which we practice and communicate. What I mean is that we know the path of any development will be to maximize opportunity within allowable costs, but we stop well short of recognizing all the levers at our disposal in setting the rules of the game. We talk about zoning codes, but rarely building codes. We talk about daylight in terms of density, but rarely in terms of dwelling units. We talk about open space, but often for the public and rarely for the individual. We talk about energy conservation, but rarely about energy reduction. And we talk about building for people today with cheaper materials, but less about building for people tomorrow with materials that don't need to be replaced. There are livability standards I observed, such as the right to multiple aspects of daylight, the right to no noise pollution, the right to live affordably without owning, the right to move units without moving neighborhoods, and the right to private open space that are deeply held by both regulations and cultures, but absent in our codes or cultural assumptions about multifamily housing. If cooperative housing can teach us one thing, it's to expand our parameters of what's fungible in terms of the definition of a dwelling unit, and what we should be less forgiving of, such as the standards for what make an urban home one you can live in forever. Secondly, projects surveyed often took decades to come to completion, highlighting the struggle of co-development. And I heard many times about the fall off of members and diverse ways in which groups started, stalled, or were abandoned. And also that the struggle does not end at construction. More often, that's when things start to become more real. Co-housing in particular takes a lot of time, mentally and physically, to contribute towards the community's meals, maintenance, and more. Not everyone in a community will have the same level of commitment, and consensus is hard. What's clear is that successful communities, those thriving for decades, come because of consistent commitment from their members on a daily, weekly, monthly, and yearly basis, and also an ability to be flexible with who lives there to grow, shrink, and diversify. That is to say, the more cooperation, more time and effort, and it's not for everyone. Because of the struggle to even get something built, both financially and agreement-wise, many projects also delivered what the market might call under-designed or not even meeting occupancy requirements. In many common spaces, fixtures were bare bones and finishes left off. The result is a loose specificity that provided the infrastructure to get the story started, but left open the ultimate plot points. What's left are projects to be built by the cooperative over time together and as sort of desire rooms, courtyards, paths, and halls. What's exciting for me is to see these buildings, streets, and landscapes become pedagogical tools themselves. While these spaces are often set up in a way to encourage participation and collaboration, it's also the case that through their informality and boundaries, negotiation among neighbors is not a suggestion, but a necessity, an activity of expansion, appropriation, that is encouraged and often necessary to express yourself and live comfortably. You could say clutter is valued over cleanliness, but it's also the case that efficiency and vibrancy are valued over individuality and orderliness. I also just want to thank so many people who are extremely generous with their time and openness, most of whom are listed here. Often these were complete strangers that after an afternoon of tea, tours, and time together, we still stay in contact. And I also want to thank my wife Elaine, who became, through only slight coercion, my translator, note-taker, interviewer, editor, and navigator. And finally, I want to thank Ron Druker, the Fellowship, and the Graduate School of Design for providing me with this opportunity and great latitude in execution. I promise I'm almost done. I really want to say that cooperative housing is not just something I'm interested in as an academic, as you've heard, but also something I'm personally passionate about. In 2021, being priced out of Somerville, my wife and 3 friends and I co-purchased a triple-decker in Jamaica Plain and are currently living together as tenants in common. The process was not simple or straightforward. Our lawyer and bank did not have rooms on their contracts for 5 signatures, and every step of the process was and continues to be us working against the grain of standard New England real estate practices. Nor was the building easy or well-maintained. But together we wrote and signed a collective contract and began to document and work on the building. Excited as a group of architects, planners, engineers, and landscape architects, but forever frustrated with what a 100-year-old lead-covered Boston building had in store. Soon after starting on this work, we applied for and were awarded the state's triple-decker decarbonization grant, a huge boon that is allowing us to electrify, insulate, and decarbonize our breezy balloon-framed timber box. It's been illuminating while traveling to see projects to try to create one ourselves at the same time. Of course, we have a standing bi-weekly co-op dinner on the calendar, but we don't always stick to the schedule. Here is mapped every meeting we should have had in light blue and every meeting we did have in darker blue. This is a surprise to my other owners here tonight. Most congesting around major project decisions and waning with holidays, attrition, or summer schedules. But it's a joy and a privilege to live with friends, to share dog care, garden care, home care, and it allows more freedom in our own lives while enriching that of our familial and collective home. All this work is being done while we are still living inside a construction site, which has its challenges. But the benefit of living with your friends is that you can sleep, shower, do laundry, or cook in each other's units if yours is a complete disaster at the end of the weekend. As part of the ongoing design, areas of the building which were previously assigned to one unit, we have chosen to share. So in lieu of triplicating space for each unit to have their own storage, parking, or wash, an effort instead has been made to share those services and open up space to eventually include a woodshop, pottery studio, co-working space, guest house, and garden. Eventually, perhaps, this might catch on, and where there currently sits several vacant lots between multifamily homes that could be sites for cooperative open space, linked together by additional dwelling units. And over time, more of the neighborhood might be both outside of speculation and outside of the assigned parcelization, creating a new future and fabric to live comfortably together forever. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If you have some questions, I think, yeah, please.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this fantastic presentation. My name is Winston. I'm a dual degree student, urban planning, design school, and public policy at the Kennedy School. 2 quick questions. First one is on the design level. You have seen so many amazing co-op design. Has there been a case where you see the design has unintended consequence, whether it be good or bad? Like the designer intended in such a way that was not realized, but then actually resulted in something different. The second question is, as you mentioned, there's affordability crisis, and I constantly think about how we can do things at scale. There's so many. So in the U.S., right? I'm pretty sure you know better than I do. There's a shortage of from 3.8 to 7.2 million affordable housing, shortage. So are there any implications you get from this, amazing year that you did? What are the implications when it comes to scaling affordability in housing? Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. Yeah, I mean, I think to the first one about unintended consequences, there's definitely a lot of elements people later ripped out. Sometimes just an element of 70s architecture that was really unhealthy or inefficient, and that's being upgraded exactly when I came to the community, new boilers and energy efficient systems. There was residents sometimes ripped entire things out, put new things in that you start a project, people made a pool and then didn't maintain it and now it's a swamp. Or collective balconies, single loaded building in Switzerland that I saw where it didn't maybe think so much about what it means to be, visibly seen by every aspect, and that can be exciting. But when one side of the building was on a highway and you don't want to open those windows, you might want to open the ones inside, but then you're seen by everyone and the window height was not the right height. So I think there was both errors from design side and resident side, but what's great is when the residents are able to have the management decisions, they can over time prioritize what to fix or change. And on affordability, it's a great point, and I think it's exciting in communities like Switzerland again, where like cooperatives have been around for so long and can help bring so much more of the market out of speculation. We don't have necessarily a shortage of buildings or houses. We have a shortage of like quote units. And so I think continuing to perpetuate homeownership in the same way, which is sort of the impetus for the title of the project, is that it's like adding one more lane to the freeway, and you're just going to vote against other people entering the market because it protects your own asset and it's not the most efficient use of land. So I think to say that like we need more subsidized affordable housing, but also this can be a way to create perpetual affordability if we set them up in a network style way. Yeah.
So that was really an outstanding presentation, and I look forward to the publication. So congratulations.
Me too.
I mean, seriously. Oh, I bet you do. The one thing that I'd be curious about is, and you didn't talk about it all that much, is the designers themselves.
Yeah.
Is this co-designers? Are they designing? Who are the designers of all these things? I mean, we get it over time, but from the get-go, and as it co-designed.
Yeah, there's also a great diversity. Sometimes it's straight up hiring an architect and they design it all, and you have your community appoints someone to be, the owner's representative, and then you meet, but a lot of times it's a little more complicated. I did find a lot of architecture, urban design, and landscape firms geared towards doing a lot of these projects because once you do one, you can learn how to do it again. And I myself, when I started doing this work, I was working on a project with 8 clients, and that's very difficult. And there was no one decision maker, and so 8 opinions on things at once you have to resolve. So often, I think from the designer side, the professional side, when you've done it again, you can kind of like also teach people how to do it. Like we talk about an experienced client, and often almost all of these were an inexperienced client, someone who's never developed or built something. So a lot of the times the professional design service partner was experienced and could lead them on a path of like how you should structure this and appoint teams and members. There's also a few of them that were those more radical self-built. There's a number of self-built projects that happened in the 70s, and people with no experience and just doing what they've seen people do and getting it done. I feel like, did I answer your question? Maybe?
Yeah, you described what it is.
Yeah.
It just strikes me as sort of funny to think that at the end of the day, a lot of these are just designed by one firm or one party, and too many clients is just a pain in the butt, which we all know it is, and yet the whole thing is meant to be cooperative. That's all. It's a funny sort of thing, and I was just curious what you thought.
I think they usually slowed it down, which was good and bad. Often there's a lot of projects where it was like a group of us got together, maybe 50 or 100 people, and then to form a co-housing community. And co-housing is almost always co-developed. And then half of them would say we want to be the urban one, and half would be the rural one. And they'd go off and do that, and they'd go off and do that. And design would come to them, and they'd fight over it and hate it and throw it out, and it would take a lot longer. And they'd have to then all go on their own and research, really think about what they want, and come to the table with sketches. And then, so it was also instructive. I talked to the few developers and designers that had to learn how to work with that system.
Excellent talk, Sam. Really fantastic. I was wondering, maybe along somewhat similar lines, it seems that if you have professionals who go into advocating for this and creating essentially a market for it by offering their services, it seems that part of what they have to offer is a design of the system of cooperation and then a design of the spaces and forms of cooperation. So you sort of are offering, you have to offer a kind of template for a way of life in addition to the spaces and forms of a way of life in order to have a kind of design firm that is replicable, it seems to me. And did you see any of that happening?
There were a lot of developer architecture firms that were trying to be vertically integrated to capture that same conundrum. And I mean, I always say to be a good housing architect, you have to be interested in politics and development and know about a pro forma. Otherwise, you're not going to get the door handle you want. And I really do feel like the Gesamtgefühl of the total design of these projects is when you can be vertically, integrated and really think about every step in the process, the end social. And a lot of times the architect or the developer was the leader of the community. Often someone with development experience or an architect leading a crusade.
I'm not talking about the vertical integration of the construction. I'm talking more about how they successfully live together. So, and I was actually surprised that you mentioned the Shakers, but you don't talk about religious communities, which seem, whether you're talking Shakers or whether you're talking Mormons, it seems like there are models of co-living that exist where you have a religious template for how one lives as a community. And what the communities you're talking about don't have that sort of template coming from without. And so I was wondering if there are firms that are trying to essentially help design systems for whether it's the blackboards and the open shelves that you talk about, or the temporal schedules that actually make a community work.
I think it's a lot of more grassroots knowledge sharing than specifically more formal aspects. So that was every community had a website with resources because they spent the last 20 years learning things, like maybe I've spent the last 3 years, and they're so eager to share it and disseminate and tell people about it. And here's this book, you should look at this, watch this talk, do you know this person? So there's a lot of that. And definitely this is one subsection of cooperative housing, and maybe a subtle underlying element is to look at ones that are a bit more diverse and a bit more socially minded. So the more religious or commune types, and also doesn't include share houses or the extremely informal ones that were hard to find online.
Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. I echo all the compliments. One comment, one question. The comment is, I really appreciate how your journey of 3 years started overlapping with the advocacy piece with the reports of something that you identify very particularly interesting, like the single staircase. So I wonder what other areas of opportunity did you find as pathways to pursue with that specificity? Because I was the most interested in your comment about we don't talk about the code, how to change the code, how to push the code. We talk about the zoning most, and we see that the effectiveness of the typology change is going to be in the building code. So I wonder what opportunities, additional opportunities, are you finding through this work?
Yeah, I think I summarized it a bit on that slide with the 5 or 6 things. I always try to ask everyone, really annoyingly like, why don't you just do a double-loaded corridor building? Like, just do this. And often it wasn't that they didn't want that, it's that that would be illegal or against the regulations and also not accepted in the market. And so I think just to talk about regulations is to say that like, it's the chicken before the egg. If you, once everyone's done doing it, once every building has a balcony at the market, you can't build something without one because then it wouldn't be accepted. But the only reason it's gonna happen everywhere is if there's some kind of carrot or stick, probably by the government, that's gonna allow that to happen. And I think we all have a way in shaping the built environment. I think we just need to be aware of all the levers that are at our disposal. And really, it's mostly been about zoning, but I tried to talk about construction type. I think ventilation codes, we ventilate way more than every other country. And construction type stairwells, energy, and all those kind of things.
Very well.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sam. It's been really a fantastic lecture. I think we learned a lot about this fantastic, you open a window that all we are very interested. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Ron, for the opportunity. Now, everybody is invited to join the Druker Design Gallery because we're going to have a meeting together. Thank you.